you would like a flyer to advertise the study beginning tonight, doesn't have to even go out today. People could start next week as well. I have a couple in my car, so just come see me afterwards. If you'd like a flyer to put up somewhere or to give to somebody who's not in our church. All right, welcome to our study in the Gospel of Luke. We're in Luke chapter 12. We began chapter 12 last week, and that's about all we can say as we began. I think because we didn't get very far, but hopefully it was instructive in some ways, although I realized while I was teaching and then afterwards looking back that because of what I had taken the night before, that my speech may have been coherent all the time. I don't know. I felt like I was fumbling for words, and then actually we went home afterwards because I was not feeling very well at all, was flushed and everything. So I did not take that same drug last night. Just took regular pain medication. So hopefully today, and if it's not coherent today, then I have nothing to blame it on.
Old age.
Except old age. Same thing we say to my mother. All right, Luke chapter 12. And I'm entitling chapter 12 and on into the first part of chapter 13 as attitudes for followers of Jesus. This comes on the heels of having Jesus kind of throwing some attitude at the Pharisees and the lawyers or scribes, and pronouncing a number of woes on them. And so we come into this section where he turns his attention, as we're told in verse 1, to his disciples, even though there are myriads of people, tens of thousands possibly of people that were gathered together there, providing the setting for what we see here in this first section of chapter 12. Verses 1 through 12, I'm calling Living in the Light of Eternity. And so we've seen the setting already in verse 1. The second part of verse 1, calling Learn to Discern, warning against hypocrisy or caution against hypocrisy. And we outlined a little bit last week as to why Jesus now turns from pronouncing these woes against false religion, against hypocrisy, to addressing his disciples when he says to them, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. All right, so I think last week we started talking about the properties of leaven, or what is leaven, and essentially we arrived at the leaven is what we call yeast, essentially, and there are certain things that yeast or leaven does, and I think we went through a couple of those last time. And remind us if you contributed, or if you remember what somebody else contributed, what did we learn about leaven last week? It grows. Okay, it's living and it continues to grow or expand in whatever it's in. What does it do to whatever it's in?
Changes it.
It changes it. And specifically, if we're talking about dough, it makes it rise, right? Anything else about leaven or yeast? All right, the very first thing Albert Barnes went through some things about leaven and comparing it to hypocrisy. And so we're going to look at those. The first one is something that you wouldn't probably think of as a characteristic of leaven, but it is true nonetheless, and that is that it may exist without being immediately detected. Leaven mixed in flour is not known until it produces its effects. So if you're baking, I'm assuming I've never baked anything in my life. No, I take that back. I did some of that friendship bread that was going around many, many years ago. But and that of course had some yeast in it to make it rise. But I suppose that you could make several loaves of bread, and if you forgot to put yeast in one, you wouldn't know until you were baking it. Is that right? Those of you that bake? Apparently none of you bake either. Or you-
think you have to like let it rise first.
Oh, you let it rise first, then you
would
bake
know
it
before-
before you put it in the oven.
But you would know, you might not know right away, but you would know.
Even, okay, so you would know at some point, but maybe not at
At
first.
least.
I mean, if you looked around and saw one loaf isn't rising before you put it in the oven, and you say, oh, I forgot to put yeast in that one. Okay, so anyway, so it's not detected readily until it starts working. So he calls that it's shrouded. And the reason for the word shrouded is because all the characteristics begin with S. Next, he says it is insinuating. Leaven will soon pervade the whole mass. So someone mentioned that. So hypocrisy will, if undetected and unremoved, soon pervade all our exercises and feelings. It only takes a little bit of it to affect a great mass. And so hypocrisy, like leaven, is spreading. And then lastly, he says it is swelling. Albert Barnes says it puffs us up, fills us with pride and vanity. No man is more proud than the hypocrite. We talked about that in the weeks we looked at chapter 11. And none is more odious to God. The religion of Jesus is one of sincerity, of humility, of an entire want or lack of disguise. The humblest man is the best Christian, and he who has the least disguise is most like his master. So it swells people up. Listen to what one author writes. This age is full of shams. Deception never stood in so eminent a position as it does at the present hour. I fear that there are only a few who love the naked truth. We can scarcely endure it in our homes. You will scarcely find a person in business who absolutely states it. Counterfeit has finally attained such an eminence that it is very difficult to detect. The counterfeit so nearly approaches the genuine item that the eye of wisdom itself needs to be enlightened before it can discern the difference. This is especially true in religious matters. There was once an age of intolerant bigotry, when every person was evaluated, and if they were not precisely up to the orthodox standard of the day, the fire devoured them. But in this age of love and acceptance, we are very apt to allow the counterfeit to pass by and to imagine that outward show is really as beneficial as inward reality. If ever there was a time when it was needful to say, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy, it is now. The minister may not need to preach this doctrine in the days of severe persecution, when the stakes are blazing and when the torture rack is in full operation, for few men and women will be hypocrites. These are the clear tests of impostors, suffering and pain and death for Christ's sake, for they will not be endured by mere pretenders. I am sure that every true child of God will at times doubt themselves, and their fear will probably take the shape of a suspicion concerning their own state. They will at times begin to be terribly alarmed, lest the reality is that their godliness is only external, and their profession of faith is nothing but an empty vanity. Those who are true Christians will sometimes suspect that they aren't truly saved, while those who are false believers will wrap themselves up in the constant confidence of their own sincerity. I know it's kind of long, but I hope it has some really good points in there. And although we can certainly perceive the validity of these comments upon our present society, apparently this is not an unusual thing to have happen. These words were uttered by Baptist pastor Charles H. Spurgeon in 1859. So to a different degree, maybe, but he was dealing with much the same thing we see today. A lot of counterfeit religion, a lot of hypocrisy. The only thing is today it's broadcast on radio and television and the internet, which was not available back then. You actually had to go someplace and hear all of the hypocrisy. All right, so that's the comparison of leaven and hypocrisy. Jesus says, beware of that. Any comments about the whole connection between leaven and hypocrisy?
Well, it's a funny thing that you should bring up yeast, because I just made a loaf yesterday. And I used yeast.
Mm-hmm.
And you got two kinds of yeast. You have the yeast that you have to put in water and get it 130 yeast. I said, yeah, put rising yeast, which means you just throw it in. And it's just amazing because you just have this dough sitting there with nothing in it. And then a few hours later, it's this big. But the thing that the observations I wanted to make with it was this, that I made bread and we had the bread and we went out for a little while. And I came back later. And you want to know what the house smelled like? It smelled like yeast.
Hmm.
It smelled like what you call bread. So even though it's contained within there, it's everywhere.
Ah,
It floats through the air. The way I found out I was a diabetic is because I kept getting yeast infections.
Hmm.
And the doctor thought, well, this is strange. And it's because I had so much sugar in my system that the yeast that's in the air all around you, okay, will interact with you. So I think that might be a little bit of an application.
Yeah.
It's something you can't see, you can't do, but it's all around you and it will react with you
mm-hmm,
if you give it a chance.
mm-hmm. And the legalism that we looked at in chapter 11 is so easily brought in to each of us, to our churches. Yeah, it just is a natural thing, it seems. And so,
Right, that's most danger.
yeah. So you can see why Jesus says beware, just like your doctor says, John, beware of yeast. Jesus says beware of hypocrisy because it has that same kind of effect. All right, any other comments?
Portion that you read about if you're truly a Christian,
Mm-hmm.
that you will question it, and if you're a Pharisee or.
So if you're false believers will wrap themselves up in the constant confidence of their own sincerity.
But it said if you're a true believer, you'll question your salvation. Is that what it said?
Yeah, he said, those who are true Christians will sometimes suspect that they aren't truly saved. Okay, why?
It's such a drastic change for me. I mean, I've not questioned it since I've been saved.
Okay, maybe it's different for those of us that didn't have that drastic change then, because I've questioned it many times. Yeah, growing up with never having not believed, I've many times wondered, am I truly saved?
For me, the peace that I've had, there's been so many changes.
Yeah, I think it's quite different for someone maybe who experienced that great change. I think of even David Brainerd, who was a great Christian man who died in his 20s of tuberculosis, but who had been a missionary to the Native Americans in Massachusetts area back in the 1600s, late 1600s, or mid to late 1600s. He was one of the Puritans. His diary is a great blessing to read. And yet in that diary, even though he had been found on his knees in the woods, his knees bleeding in the snow when Indians came and got him because he had been there praying so long for them and was ministering to them, even he had doubts once in a while that he was simply convincing himself that he was a Christian.
Difference is that's what Charles Spurgeon was trying to imply, which sometimes was hard to understand, is humility. So like think about the two prayer people, the one who prayed in public, who was a Pharisee, and the one who prayed silently and said, God be merciful to me, a sinner. So like when you are a true Christian, you understand the depths of your sin and you ask yourself, why would God forgive me?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you are not truly sorrowful for your sin, you're like, you know what, I'm a great person. I'm a great Christian. I'm pretty awesome, So that's kind of the difference. And so every true Christian has a moment of like, man, maybe you don't doubt it, but you also understand that you definitely need a savior, and there's some of us that, really even like, I am so bad, how could God even forgive me? And then we sometimes doubt that God did, that kind of thing. That's what I think is what he was trying to imply.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true.
That leads me back to that question about that God chose us. Because how many times I think why would God choose me?
Mhm.
You know?
Yeah.
That's kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
But I know that he died on the cross for me.
Mhm.
Otherwise, there's no hope for me.
Right, yeah,
No, Bill, I think I fall on the side of pondering this. Because the biggest concept that I had to learn as a very Christian it was God and not me. My
Mhm.
works doesn't affect one way or the other my salvation. I have total trust in that.
Mhm.
But what I do question, I think this is what we may be looking at here, is the effects of that salvation. Is that salvation enough to make me a good person? And the answer to that is no. Okay, that salvation makes me right in God, but I am still the animal that I always was, but my behaviors have changed. My outlook has changed. My worldview has changed because I have the scriptures guiding me. I have a weapon to use against it. And I think that's what we question. Okay, I was just listening to the song of the Catholic song, be merciful unto me, unto God, for all the things I've said and done and not what I've done. God has already done that. He did that 2,000 years ago. I don't question that. But that's my salvation. He took me out of that. My everyday life is a day of choices. And the only way I can put those choices together is by the word of God. And then I deviate from that. And that kind of question.
yeah, and that sometimes is what, going back to what several people said, understanding that God has chosen us, and that if we're not acting like we should, then we begin to question, well, am I really chosen by God? Because otherwise I would not be doing what I'm doing, whatever. And so it's that lack of confidence in ourselves that separates the true believer from the false believer who has every confidence in themselves.
That moves you to the scripture that says, where Judas, the Lord touched Jesus, a good master, and he turned on dying and said, do you not know that there's no one good but God?
Mhm.
Period. Not no one good plus John Tiger is good. No, I'm still what I am, and I'm a human being. So I'm a fallen man.
Mhm.
But I'm a fallen man who is not alive because of the cross of Jesus Christ.
All right, so I think the main point that I think Spurgeon was getting at here is that hypocrisy covers over what a person really is. And that hypocrisy makes one immune, in a sense, to understanding what their true state is. They think they can trust in their works as being an indication of their righteousness, like the Pharisee, when in reality, a true believer will recognize that his works don't count for anything, and it's only in Christ that he has salvation. Okay. All right, verses 2 through 9 of chapter 12 parallel with Matthew 10, 26 to 33, but it occurs at a different time. The Matthew 10 passage says many of the same things, but it was spoken to his disciples in Galilee, whereas verses 2 through 9 here are spoken to his disciples as they are either in Judea or getting ready to go into Judea from the area of Perea. So let's look at what he says here. In verse 2, he goes on, and after having said, beware of the 11 of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy, he goes on to point out something about that hypocrisy. He says, but there is nothing covered up that will not be revealed, and hidden that will not be known. Now, nothing covered up. This word for covered up indicates completely covered. And that's what hypocrisy does. It makes a person think that what he really is completely covered by his outward works, by what he's doing outwardly. And thinks that it won't be known. But you notice the first word of verse 2 is the word but. At least it is in my translation. It's the same in yours as well, but. maybe now. What?
Verse 2?
Yeah, verse 2. 4.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
Has the same connotation, but maybe not as forceful. But indicates a contrast that between what the Pharisees were doing and the reality. There is nothing covered up that will not be revealed. In other words, we might say it would all come out in the wash. It's all going to become evident. Now, how can Jesus be so confident about this maxim? Well, the art of being a hypocrite depends on concealment. And all of us are hypocrites to some extent or another because, because we are concealing maybe who we really are. Sometimes it's sin. Sometimes it's just we think that people won't accept us the way our personality is or whatever. But the hypocrisy especially depends on concealment. But one day it's all going to be revealed. We only can be hypocrites before men, but never before God. So this speaks to what we call, I saw this, I just had to put this in here. That'd be a great thing to have around your doorpost, wouldn't it? Especially a kid's room. I don't know.
Get psychological help.
But we're talking about the area, what's called omniscience. Omniscience means all knowing. God is omniscient. Now, this is something that at one time in our country was well known and well accepted. Not so much today. I recently watched an episode of Leave It to Beaver. How many of you ever watched Leave It to Beaver? There was a theological lesson in many episodes, but in this one in particular, in this episode, Beaver had lied, and his mother was counseling him in his bedroom that if no one else knew what he had done, in the future, if he lied, even if it never came out, God would know, because God knows everything. And Beaver says, even through the roof? She says, yeah, but even through the roof. Even through the ceiling? God can see through the ceiling. What if I'm in my closet? God still knows. Wouldn't you like to see that in a sitcom today? Not going to happen. But God knows everything. And we need to get that word out again, I guess, and make sure that our family especially knows, just like Beaver's mother, that God is omniscient. He knows everything. So verse 3, accordingly, well, I was going to show you a picture of Beaver. I forgot. There's Beaver talking to his mother. What you have spoken in the dark will be heard in the light, and what you have whispered in the inner rooms will be proclaimed upon the housetops. The inner rooms, if you think about a house at that time, there were rooms in the middle of the house that didn't have an exterior window or an exterior wall. And that was considered the safest place to keep things. They didn't have safes back then. Oftentimes they would just dig a hole in the ground and bury it. But if you did that near an outside wall, and if anybody found out where it was, they could just dig through the wall and steal that. But in the inner chambers, the inner rooms, that was not accessible from the outside. And so that was considered a safe place to bury things. And so he's talking about things that were whispered in the inner rooms. That's where you went to tell secrets too, because no one outside could hear. But Jesus says that if you've hidden it in the dark, it's going to be heard in the light. Or if you said it in the dark, it's going to be heard in the light. If you've whispered in the inner storage chambers, then it'll be proclaimed upon the housetops. Now, in our situation today, proclaiming something on a housetop doesn't really mean a lot. But remember how their houses were. The houses were next to one another, sometimes using the same walls as one another. And so if you got up on your housetop to proclaim something, it could be heard a long distance. So, equivalent today is okay, everything you whispered is going to be on Facebook or X, formerly Twitter. the same idea. Not only would everything that you have said be known, but it will also be proclaimed to everyone else. Now, that's a scary notion. But remember, he's talking about hypocrisy here too. He's not just talking about, things in our lives. I think time we whisper to somebody, whatever. He's talking about what people really are on the inside is going to be proclaimed so that everyone knows what it is. So the hypocrites will be exposed. You can use it that way. Hypocrites will be exposed. It'll become known what they are. So at the time, remember, at the time here, when Jesus is saying these things, who is in charge of the whole religious system? The Pharisees, who are the hypocrites. And so for the disciples to think about being with Jesus and proclaiming his message, they know they're going to be coming up against the religious system. They've seen Jesus is coming up against it. They've seen the reaction of the Pharisees, especially, and we'll see the Sadducees more against Jesus. Remember, we've seen several times in the past few chapters, they're trying to think of a way to kill him. And so as they consider that, they may think that they're up against a foe that can't be defeated. It's a losing battle. But Jesus is telling them, don't worry about it. These hypocrites will be exposed. Someday, these hypocrites will be exposed for what they are. And everyone will know it. So don't be concerned about that. Beware of them, but don't give in to them. Don't fear them in the sense of fearing what they'll do to you. In fact, he goes into that in the next couple of verses where he says, I say to you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body. Do not be afraid of them. Don't fear persecution. Now notice he addresses them as my friends. This is, of course, opposed to the Pharisees and the lawyers that we saw back in chapter 11, verses 43, 46, 53, where he's addressing these guys and pronouncing woes upon them. And he says to his disciples, don't be afraid. And of course, this may have been needed after hearing what Jesus had said was going to happen to the Pharisees eventually, but also in addressing them as his friends in relationship to the hypocrisy that they would have to deal with. All right. Well, I thought we'd take a little break from talking about being afraid and just kind of enlighten our minds a little bit to some different words that have to do with fear. And we call fears what? What's the word for fear? For different kinds of fear. Okay, it wasn't a very clear question. We call them phobias. Okay, look down through these phobias and see if you recognize any of them. Maybe you have some of them. What do you think?
Must be birds. That one that starts with
Ornithophobia, fear of birds, yeah. Yeah, fear of numbers. Yeah.
Pedophobia.
What, fear of what?
Heat, pedophobia.
Oh, I don't see pedo. Oh, there it is. Yeah. No, that's pediophobia, a little bit different than peta. It's a different fear. It's not feet.
Philophobia, fear of books. Is there such a thing?
No, no.
All right.
Philo is a different word. It's not books.
Photophobia, fear of light. Brotherhood? Fear of light.
It's close.
Fear, oh, friends.
Which one are you talking about?
They're getting your picture.
Philophobia?
Photophobia.
Philophobia is a fear of
Light.
love. It's brotherly love. Philadelphia.
But if,
Second to the last one, that's the one I was talking about.
Oh, podophobia. Oh, that is feet. Okay, I thought you were talking about pediophobia is fear of dolls.
doll.
Dolls.
How about the last one?
You kind of-
Pogonophobia is,
Fear of pogo sticks.
Really long one in the middle.
all right, pogonophobia. I'll tell you what, I'll just reveal them all here. Unless anybody else have another guess before I reveal them all.
That's
Pogonophobia, the fear of beards.
fear of bugs?
Yeah.
Belly buttons? Oh, then I have that one, the next one, I have phobia
Fear of snakes?
and spiders, what's that one? Arachnophobia.
Yeah,
It's not even on there.
yeah. Oh, there's a lot more than this. I had other ones listed too, but I,
Like the weird ones.
yeah,
The fear of fear.
Yeah, I mean, fear. Fear.
yeah, phobophobia. The fear of fear. Can you imagine trying to treat that?
Fear of fear?
Yeah, fear of fear. Yeah.
Fear of beards.
Now, of course, what he's talking about here is not on this list. Because if he's telling them not to be afraid of those who kill the body, that would be thanatophobia. Thanatops. I don't know if you remember in high school reading a poem, I think called Thanatop. Was it called Thanatops? Something like that, about death. Thanatophobia. So Jesus says, don't be afraid of those who can kill the body. Don't be afraid of death. It's not where I want to be yet. Okay, so the point Jesus is making is that man's power over man is strictly limited to this life. A man can destroy another man's life, but not his soul. So don't fear physical death, but spiritual death. Matthew Henry says, the power of your enemies is a limited power. So beware of the Pharisees. Don't fear them, but beware of them. And he says, after that, have no more they can do. So what more can persecutors do to you than take your life? That's it. And we could probably go through even what we know of people who have given their lives for Christ to show that they did not fear death. I know we often wonder, I think all of us probably wonder, would we be able to stand up in the face of death like so many we've read about? And they wondered that too until they faced it, but Christ gives the strength to go through that. And Jesus says, don't fear. Matthew Henry again says, those whom Christ owns for his friends need not be afraid of any enemies. All right, our time is up this week. Next time we'll look at maybe a couple of examples of how this plays out, how it played out with the apostles and how it played out in history and other people's lives of those that were able to stand firm for Christ and were not afraid of what man could do to them. Any final comments? Okay, hope to see you all